crafting a series or franchise character.
Wow, just like last time.
Yeah. Well, I guess we should start off by introducing ourselves.
I'm Jackie Gamber. I write science fiction, fantasy, and horror, among other things, but that's my favorites. My current novel right now, I have short stories and things out in the marketplace, but my current novel is with 7 Star Press. It's a fantasy called Red Heart. And I normally would have it with me, but I don't have it with me.
I'm Michael West. I write mainly horror, but some dark sci-fi and dark fantasy. I have the first of 3 novels coming out from 7 Star Press for one series.
Yes, 7 Star Press.
Cinema of Shadows, that it'll actually be out in 2 weeks, but we have it here, and actually the book launch is tonight at 9 in the room below this one.
Shut up. I'm going to be on time for a panel at this
We're
show.
introducing ourselves, but we started there, so we missed out.
Okay, well then I guess I don't get to find out who I am.
Or you anyway.
Darn it.
And then it hasn't been officially announced yet, but there's a
Sneak preview.
dark fantasy series coming out from 7 Star called the Legacy of the Gods. That'll be out. First book will be out in March.
Cool. Awesome. I am Stephen Shrewsbury, because no one else is. I've my novel Thrall come out through 7 Star this last year. And sure.
Also available at the Literary Underworld booth.
Yes, also a little. I write pretty intense action fantasy stuff. If you liked Robert E. Howard or Karl Edward Wagner, that's my kind of fantasy, not really overblown stuff. I write horror novels as well, Hog, and it's a pretty intense, like Edward Lee-ish horror novel, but it's very rural, almost southern country. I have a character named Joel Stewart that is appearing in Hellbilly next year, and he's in Hellbilly, he's in Last Man Screaming, which is a Lovecraftian Western from Badman books. And I've written Stronger Than Death and Tormentor and a bunch of different collections. And as Elizabeth said last night, he goes, "What are you up to for stories now?" And I said, "I think it's 400 published, but that's about right." But I can think of stories in those bizarre ways sometimes. As earlier, I didn't know what steampunk was, and as soon as somebody told me what it was, I come up with an idea. So that's just how it works sometimes. So.
Well, I definitely don't feel like I'm bragging to say my 11th book comes out next month. Yay! But he says that he has 400 stories. So.
Sure sets the bar a little tall.
I didn't say they were all awesome. I just said they were published.
My name is Eric Wilson. I don't know if I'm the only one, because I say my full name is Jen Eric. It's Eric Wilson. I mean, such a boring name, but there it is. That is my real name.
It's very Nordic.
Yeah, Nordic.
Yeah.
Okay. Since we're doing series character, this is a Jerusalem's Undead trilogy, and my series character is on the front there, a girl named Gina Lazarescu, who is a Romanian Jewish girl who finds out she has half immortal blood, and I can go into it later, but that's the series I'll talk about instead of getting into other books. But I love writing. I've done everything from inspirational novels to modern mysteries to supernatural suspense and pretty dark, dense vampire stuff. So.
I'm D.A. Adams. I'm the author of the Brotherhood of Dwarves series, also from 7 Star Press.
Yay, 7 Star Press!
And also from the Literary Underworld.
Load up the deck.
So this is the 7 Star Press.
Yeah, this should be.
I suppose it is, except for Eric.
Submit something.
And Elizabeth.
Despite all the rumors, I'm not Kurlach and I'm not 7 Star.
Yeah, that's true. I'm sorry.
Similar to Stephen, I write very, very fast-paced fantasy, very action-driven. It's also very character-driven, and a lot of sword play and a lot of character development going on.
I'm Elizabeth Donald, and I am the zookeeper of the Literary Underworld. And since I am not with 7 Star, I swear.
Yay, 7 Star!
I like 7 Star. I to. I just haven't gotten
You
around.
applaud the fact that she's not with us?
I'm not that.
We still have.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. You know, you're saying that you're within smacking distance. I'm not dumb enough to try to smack shrews.
Just a big pussycat.
What was that? I couldn't quite hear you. Since we're talking about series characters, I have a ridiculous number of series characters running around in my work. My first 3-book series was a vampire series put out originally by Alora's Cave and eventually by Caradwen Press, their mainstream imprint, and is now Alora's Cave again because they closed the mainstream imprint, and I don't even understand that myself. I'm currently halfway through my zombie series. The first was The Cold One, starring Major Sarah Harvey, which should amuse several of the people here because the real Sarah Harvey is this very sweet and friendly.
She's a darling.
She's a doll, and a very dear friend of mine. When I asked to borrow her name for my former Marine chain-smoking zombie fighter, she said, "Sure, I can explore my inner badass." So that's The Cold Ones and Blackfire, and the third and final book in that series will come out sometime next year, especially when I write it. In between, this is my short story collection, Setting Suns, which has stories from the Sanctuary, my Sanctuary science fiction apocalypse series, and I've been writing short stories off and on for the past 2 years that are going to be collected in a book at the end of the year called Moonlight Sonata, that's coming out from New Babel, and it's got a couple stories from Nocturnal Urges, it's got a couple of stories from the zombie series, it's got a recurring character named Sergeant Shane Moore. Shane's a dear old friend of mine.
Who haven't you borrowed a name from?
I am horrible with names. If I was left to my own devices, everyone would be, Smith and Jones. And so I started stealing the names of my friends, and then they started showing up in multiple books. There's one friend of mine from high school. I have killed her in every series I've done. Every universe I've created, she ends up dead.
Is it personal?
I have one of my old bosses that dies in everything I do.
See, I kill the people I like. I don't know which of us
He has a different name, but he's there with personality.
I like the idea of a series where some, or even just one continued universe where a character, Sergeant Moore showed up as a minor character in a novel that hasn't come out yet, titled Yellow Roses. But he was so much fun to write as a cop who could see dead people. And it was so much fun to write that he started cropping up in this short story or that short story, and now he's like in half my stuff now, which just has tickled the real Shane all the pieces. He even critted a couple of the pieces for me so he could check police procedure. He's a former cop.
That's awesome.
All right. So, when you set about making a franchise character, what makes this character larger than life enough that they can sustain a franchise?
Well, the word franchise is a little tricky to me because I keep thinking of McDonald's French fries, so I can't quite. But and I can't necessarily say, speaking for me, I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't know that I set out to create a franchise character. Now series, yeah, because and Red Heart is a series, by the way, the Leland Dragon series. This is the first time in the middle of the second one. Mike on that one for me. And the third, yeah, all through Southern Star Press. But when he presented himself to me, I knew that his story wasn't going to be told in one book alone. And so I imagine it's the character arc of individuals. In fact, mine is kind of a multi-generational storyline as well. And so one isn't enough. And I imagine, right, it would be the overarching story that needs to be told, in a metamorphosis sort of a thing. You could end it in the first one. Some TV series should have ended it in the first one. Don't know when and to quit, but that would be my 2 cents on that.
No, I agree. When I wrote Major Sarah Harvey's fight against the zombies, it was never supposed to be a franchise. It was supposed to be a novella that was part of an anthology for traditional monsters written in a non-traditional way. And then the anthology fell apart by the time I had it done, and so Samstott picked it up as a standalone novella. And nobody was more surprised. Well, actually, maybe it was Samstott that was more surprised than me. It sold out the whole print run in 48 hours.
Wow.
So they said, hey, how about a sequel? How about a series? Oh, okay. I mean, it was fun. I liked writing it. So I probably would have killed fewer people in the first book if I had known I was going to be writing a series.
Because seriously, now you have to come up with all this names.
Now I got to kill more people. If they survive, I mean, if somebody survives to the end of the book, I might choose to torment them again in the future. But I don't know that I ever said the first vampire book certainly wasn't intended to be a series. It was, hey, I'm going to write a vampire romance because I really need money. And then it runs out and wins the Darrell Award and was a finalist for the Prism Award. Okay, I guess I'll write more.
Yeah. I guess right.
Folks show up often?
When I wrote my first novel, I set it in a fictional town of Harmony, Indiana. There is a new Harmony, Indiana, so I said, well, if there's a new Harmony, there needs to be a Harmony. So I set about writing that story, and then when there was a cinema, and that gets referred to in that novel, and then when I came up with the idea of what would be cool if years later we went back to that, and that was all the things that had happened were now haunting it. I said, then I did Cinema of Shadows, which is set in the same town, and since it's set in the same town, naturally people from that town make an appearance. And I had sold the wide game to a different publisher, Graveside Tales, and then I did this novel and sold it to Seven Star, and then they said, do you think you could turn that into a franchise? And I said, well, it's technically the second book, so I always set more books in that town. And so it's nice. It's nice though that as I'm now working on the next book in the series, Spook House. It's nice to see these characters kind of evolving and having their life of their own, and things that have happened to them in the past, I can explore more. So it's kind of nice to have that larger canvas to work with, that where you're not confined to just the one 80 to 100,000 word novel to tell it all in. In fact, originally the fantasy book series that I'm doing was supposed to be 3 books. I envisioned it as a trilogy. And then I sat down and I started mapping out the second book and how I'd have to get all this information in to set up the climax. And I said, that's 2 books. It's got to be 2. So now instead of a trilogy, it's a quadrilogy.
Yeah, what do you call those? Quartet?
Quartet.
Well, so, I mean, what's actually the difference, say, between an anthology, a trilogy, a series, and a franchise?
Well, an anthology is a collection of different stories by different authors.
Collection is by
Collection
one author.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's different stories by one author. And there have been anthologies and collections that have all had a similar theme, where it's like there's a collection out there that was all set in the same town, and so everybody had to set their stories in this town, and the editor gave you backstory on this town, so everybody had to set it in this town. So I mean there are anthologies that do that are in a way a franchise all in one,
Okay.
because everybody is telling the stories of the same thing. But usually a collection is by one author, an anthology is by multiple authors, and then a series and a franchise.
Like Lord of the Rings trilogy, he set out to write. If you set out originally to think I'm going to tell this in 3 books, whereas he also wrote, Tolkien wrote The Hobbit along with Lord of the Rings. That Lord of the Rings is a trilogy. Hobbit's a separate story, same universe, shall we say?
Right.
When I set out to write Thrall, I did not have any intention of writing another story but the main character. The name come from this Blue of the Shining Spear as a Celtic god, which I wrote about in Godforsaken, who Lucan McAllister worships, and his spear was named Gorias, and I thought that was an awesome name. And for some reason, Gorias became Legal, which sounds rather French, but he's the farthest thing from a Frenchman you'd ever find. And he's this grizzled old 700-year-old warrior that's at the end of the line, John Wayne and the Shootist. He's done it all, and he's got to fight by his guile. and he's dying, and he's kind of, I pick up his story, he's fully formed, and he's intense, and he's, as the reviewers say, hard to like, but you can't help but like him. But I had no intention of writing another story. I could see it. And Mike Oliveri said, "Drew, sell the first one before you think about writing another one." So I didn't write another one. Now they're wanting me to write another one, and I have written a prequel to it, and there's plenty of stories with him in it. But it's an interesting character because certain times it isn't that I've got to get from point A to point B to point C when you craft that. Some people do craft a series that way and say, well, I want to tell this because the Sith has to come back and all this, and the Jedi comes back in the third part. And this all ties together, for example, in Star Wars. Now, I did not set out to do that, but I'm going to tell more about his life, which was interesting I didn't. Joel Stewart, that I write about in my horror novels, is a Confederate Missouri Raider that I've written about when he's a spirit, when he's dead. I've written about him when he's 61 in Bad Magic. I just wrote Last Man Screaming. He's a little bit younger than that in Juarez, with the Black Bible from Nameless Cults. And I've just written one where he's 91 years old. And there's parts of his life. How did Howard say it about Conan? He said, the stories came to me out of sequence. The first Conan story was ripped off from the Cole story, Phoenix on the Sword, when Howard said, Conan stepped fully formed into my life. He was king and old with the first Conan story. People don't realize that he wasn't this young. The one they want to read about is the young brash warrior who's getting laid and getting jewels and losing them and fighting creatures. The cool Conan, I thought, was the aging, hardened, hating the world, no tomorrow guy. I'd love to write a King Conan novel. I would love to do it, but they don't let me. But anyway, maybe not now. But anyway, that's sometimes you don't intend on a character taking on a life of his own. With Rolf Gorias and Stewart keeps speaking to me almost to the point that I can't. And he says himself, he's telling these stories sometimes as an old man in first person, sometimes he's not. And another one just occurred to me the other day, and as I told you before, sometimes I got to quit thinking about ideas because I'm writing something else. I'm like, okay, I'll write that one later. But I was like, oh Christ, I didn't know he was in New Orleans. Suddenly he was in New Orleans in the 1880s. Because when he was an old man, he makes a reference back, and I'm like, what are you talking about? We haven't done that one yet. But
that's the marinade file. I have the file on my computer where something random will jump into my head, and I'm in the middle of writing a news story for the newspaper that pays me, and so pop up the little text edit file, write down whatever the hell it is, and chuck it in the marinade file. And the next time I'm desperately seeking an idea, I take a walk through that file and see which of them's ready to get tossed onto the broiler.
So my 13-year-old said, New Orleans, what if he wakes up in his coffin and they're trying to turn him into a zombie? I go, cut it out! Cut it out! I go, cut it out. I'll think of that later. And then I'm like, maybe he got called down there to investigate why they're killing all these Confederate veterans. So that is, probably going to be what that story's called.
Stop it? That's going to be the title?
Holy shit, John, stop it. But no, that probably won't be it. I'll probably have to edit that a little bit.
My turn?
Yeah. Yes, it's your turn.
I did want to ask, how many of you are writers, wannabe writers, whatever? Because I'm assuming that's why you're here.
Oh, you
I don't
poor
really know.
souls. Can we talk you out of it?
Run! No, my publisher with this trilogy, when we sat down for the first book, they sat me in a room with a marketing team, and my publisher has a chalkboard, and he says, okay, in one word, what is Field of Blood about? And publishers love this kind of crap. Like, give us your story in one sentence. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this, that you need your elevator pitch kind of idea, what you can say.
I hate that.
Yeah. Well, the truth is you do need that, because that's how those people think. They're not creative people, they're...
You say it's about 400 pages.
Yeah.
I'm going to use that the next time they ask me that.
Flannery O'Connor, who I actually happen to like, Flannery O'Connor, she actually said you need every word to tell your story. Essentially, why would you be telling a 400-page story if you don't need every word in that? I mean, I could just... Anyway, so my editor says, she sits there and she says, infection. I'm like... Okay, sure, fine, write infection on the board. So he goes, well, what's book number 2? And I haven't even written book number 2. What's the word for that? So this is how the publishers think, okay? So they want to be able to figure out how to market you, how to put you in this little niche, how to tell other people in one sentence, that kind of thing. And it is good to think through that a little bit. I mean, I actually do that somewhat to go, what is the real core of my story? Though I normally don't do that until later on into the book when it starts to reveal itself to me more. So with the Jerusalem's Undead trilogy, the real core of the story was that I love taking history and playing with it, but bringing it into the modern sense. And a little bit it plays into my family history. My father, from his own generational issues, ended up being a pastor and running off with a girl in my sister's youth group. And so I wanted to learn, how do I not repeat the mistakes of the past? When I got married, I was afraid to get married, thinking, what am I going to do? So
stay away from the youth group.
Do not write teen fiction.
There you go.
That's just throwing
the
it
truth
out
is, I
there.
have 2 teen daughters, and so when all their daughters are coming, I mean, all their friends are coming over, you know, that went through my mind as they were growing up, like, I don't want to be like my dad. So my dad's a great guy, and he's changed a lot. So anyway, my point of saying that, though, is that I love to take history, find out mistakes from history, and learn from them, and that kind of idea. So I found out in 1989, outside the old walls of Jerusalem, a bulldozer broke through the walls of an old tomb that was a 2,000-year-old tomb, and it was right underneath the field of blood, which is where Judas hung himself and spilled forward into the field, spilled his guts and his blood. And actually, in the Bible, the only person that ever says Satan entered is Judas. There's demon possession, but the only one Satan entered is Judas. And the Jews believe life is in the blood. So I thought, if Judas was inhabited by Satan and his blood seeped down in the soil, what happened to these bones that were released in 1989? So that was really the inspiration for my story. And then I needed a franchise character, a series character. And so I decided I want to work in Romanian stuff. And in 1989, there were orphanages across Romania ended up with AIDS outbreaks, and to this day they don't know for sure why. So I decided to dovetail those 2 years and 2 kind of mystery things. And so I was like, okay, my main characters are Romanian, and why not a girl? And girls are the bigger group of readers. So that was how basic it came down to. Romania, girl, and she'll be young because I wanted to go for 3 books and I want her to grow. So there you go.
That's very cool.
That's cool.
Well, for me, the genesis of my series is a little bit of an odd story. Originally, when I went to college, I went with the intention of being a writer and of being a fantasy writer. That was my goal as I was 17, 18 years old. And when I got to college, it was beat into our heads. You do not write genre work. If you want to be taken seriously, you're going to write mainstream literature. And I was young, I was very impressionable, and I listened to that. And so I tried to force myself into writing mainstream literature. And I really struggled. It took me a year. I mean, I wrote a few short stories that I'm proud of, but I really struggled to find a voice. And I got so frustrated and so beat down by it, I ended up giving up writing. And I stopped writing for about 4 years. And then one night I was watching The Two Towers, and just had this epiphany that, why the hell am I not writing this? Why am I not writing fantasy? That's what I set out to do. And I'm not made to write mainstream literature, but I am made to write. That's what I am supposed to do. And so because I was so frustrated from having beaten my head against the wall for so many years, I didn't start writing right away. I thought about, well, if I were going to tell a fantasy story, what story would I want to tell? And I had these 2 characters from my childhood. One was the character that I wanted to write about when I was 17, 18 years old. And the other was a D&D player, a D&D character that I used all the time. And I thought, if I was going to write about one of these 2, what story would I tell? And I molded and I molded and I molded. And finally I decided, what if I put these 2 guys together? And what if I joined them together and had an adventure that they went on as a tandem? And so I really thought about that. And because so many years had passed from when I originally met these characters as a teenager to then being 31 years old and starting to craft this story, I had to make them evolve, and I had to look at them in a new light. And so the original character, the one that I originally wanted to write about, his name is Khrushchev. And in my teenage years, he was a real badass. He was the guy that nobody messed with, and he was typical teenage invincible warrior. And I thought that I don't want to do that. That's not the story I want to tell now. So I rethought him as, what would he be like as the old king, the old man who's no longer the badass. He's lost that edge. He's no longer the invincible warrior. He's broken down. He's become an alcoholic. he's lost his glory, and he's mired in this life. And that was when the story really began to unfold, and I really began to see what this tale was going to be, was in rethinking those two characters and thinking, how can I get them together?
We were talking about how series characters come to us, and I have to admit that probably my favorite character I've ever written, and only very few people know about her, is Aurora Crawford, and she literally came to me in a dream. When I was 17, it's the first piece that I ever finished. I was 17 and I dreamed of this woman who was rescuing someone from inside a burning factory, some sort of paramilitary person. And she was trying to escape while the factory is burning down around her. She's trying to escape by climbing a rope ladder. And I know that her people are waiting on the top of the roof of the building. And I know that they are waiting for her even as the building is burning under their feet. And I can see her today, how she climbed that ladder, her fierce determination, bordering on obsessive determination to reach the top. And that there was something about her so powerful that the people on top would wait until the building literally collapsed underneath them, rather than leave her behind. So I woke up and thought, well, that's awesome. I should write about her. And it so happened my high school English teacher was requiring us to write something creative for our spring project, so I wrote a novella titled Sanctuary. And it was awful. It was terrible. It was everything you'd expect a 17-year-old girl who was in love with Terminator 2 and Aliens to write. Because, of course, I was in love with science fiction. Therefore, she was fighting aliens. Aliens had invaded the Earth, and we lost the war, but she's still fighting the battle, and her people are fighting this guerrilla warfare. Keeping in mind that I'm a 17-year-old kid who's never done any of that stuff. Oh, it was terrible. And I printed off, I rewrote it again in college. It didn't get much better. I printed off like a dozen copies of this 90-page novella for my friends and called it done, because of course I wasn't going to be a writer when I grew up or anything. Some of them still have their copies. They won't burn them. But that story has stuck with me ever since. And when I was trying to get into publishing, I started writing short stories, because they tell you that you should write short stories before you write novels. And I was banging my head against the wall, and the most fun I had was writing. I wrote 3 short stories that were set in that world where the aliens have occupied Earth. And one of them was about Crawford and her second in command fighting their way through the streets of New York. And those stories ended up in Setting Suns in my short story collection. Damn if I don't get letters from a zillion people who want the novel out there, and I say, you realize it sucks. There's a reason why your 3rd novel is the one that gets published. You'll write a novel and you'll try to shop it, and then later you'll be so glad that nobody picked it up. Because your 1st novel sucks. Your 2nd novel sucks a little less. Your 3rd novel is the one that, well, hopefully, is the one that breaks through the crap and becomes something that you can publish and be proud of. Someday I'm going to have to go back and rewrite that damn thing, because everyone wants more Sanctuary. I've obviously tapped into something there that they really enjoy as much as I enjoy writing it. I love writing Aurora. I wish I didn't do it so badly the first couple of times. But I think that if there's a character that is really strong and real to us, it shows through in the writing. If there's a character that's just, okay, this is stock character number 67 that needs to fill this niche in this story, then I think it shows. I think if the character is really, like you mentioned, King Conan being so real to you, if that's how the character first appears to you, then that's how you want to write them, and it shows through in something that enraptures the audience.
Some of the minor characters that I've written, and usually ones I thought were just to fill a scene, like a cop that I thought just would show up at the scene and do his job or something, end up taking on a life of their own. Like, man, I got to keep going with this, and they become readers' favorite characters. They'll be like, I love that guy, I want to see him again. And to me, there is a time where you have to shut that off. But in general, I think if you're loving it, just go with it, because a lot of times those have changed my stories in drastic ways, but made them better.
Well, sometimes characters just do not want to die. They don't want to die when they're supposed to. I had a character in the book I'm writing now that was just supposed to be there as a victim to set the whole thing in motion. And darn it, if she didn't have a stun gun in her purse. Why? Where'd you get that? It's just like, it's like that scene in Big Trouble in Little China when the guy pulls out and starts doing it. He's just like, what? Where?
Where's that come from?
Yeah. That's the look I had. I'm like, well, now I got to write about a stun gun. But they do. They sometimes characters know their story better than we know their story as the authors.
One of my vampires showed up that way as I was really stuck in the second vampire book. My main character wasn't talking to me at all. She was completely boring. So one of the tricks I do is the character is not real to me. I will write their life story. Set aside the book and write the life story. Most of that never goes into the book. It's just something that I know. And I started writing Samantha's history, and I started to realize that her life story was way more interesting than the book I was writing. And I decided to restructure the book so that each chapter would open with a flashback to her life. So starting with the most recent and going back in time so that the last chapter would open with how she became a vampire. And damn it, halfway through the book, this character who kept showing up in the flashback suddenly shows up in downtown Memphis in the main story and set the whole book veering totally in another direction. My editor's like, oh, okay, this is nothing like the outline we bought, but hey, we like it. And he's, of course, he's a fan favorite. People have shown me T-shirts they've made about Diego and being a psychotic killer that it was then turned into a vampire and it doesn't improve his disposition.
I think really hit on something that is probably my favorite aspect of writing is that act of discovery.
Yes. When
the characters do surprise you and you learn something about them and go, well, I totally did not expect that. Right. And then when you, I also love when you as a writer veer off the course and the characters correct you and tell you, no, that's not the right way to go. That to me, I think, is what keeps me coming back day after day is to have those moments of discovery of the characters.
How many of you have had that happen while you're writing? Okay, how many of you have been told you're psychotic or you have schizophrenia? I've been told that, and a friend of mine who's very much hands-on, does carpentry work, I said, have you ever been building a house where you've poured the foundation, you got 6 inches off? You're like, oh no, well, and then you end up adding a closet or something, and you're like, wow, that actually works in this room better. It's the exact same thing. It's just anywhere where you kind of let it go off the plan a little bit, and it ends up working better. And he was like, oh, okay, I get it. He couldn't think of it in a creative way, but it's something with his hands that made sense. I think everybody experiences it in different ways in life, and for me, it's part of the walk of faith as an artist, as a creator, to just go, okay, I'm going to trust the story to lead me. And sometimes when I have writer's block, it's really that I'm just not trusting myself to start writing a paragraph and finding out, oh, now I see where to go.
There was a rocket scientist who told me one time that nothing is ever built according to the blueprint. Because it never ends up being exactly like the blueprint.
Did you work for NASA?
No.
Well, just like, the book, I don't know about you guys, but my books are never but similar to the outline that I turned in. I didn't used to outline. I used to just write. And now, my publishers, for some reason, they want to know what the book's about before they'll sign on the contract. I don't know why. So I come up with the outline, and then they never seem to mind that the final book that's turned in is like, wow, so the killer was somebody else completely different.
Well, I'll sometimes have the last chapter fully written, and because there are authors out there that can just let it go, but I have to have some goal that I'm working toward. But that last chapter that I write at the beginning is never the one that ends up in the book. The characters do their thing, and I just say whatever. And finally, when we end up there, sometimes it's close, but it's never exactly the same.
You can go too far in that direction, though, because I know some authors who talk about full conversations they've had with their characters and the deals they make with their characters, and the character refused to let me do that. It gets to be a little like, okay, at some point you got to realize you are God to the people and the characters who will do as I say.
Right.
Damn it.
Your invisible friend Harvey really can't tell you what to do with the story. You're master of it.
Yeah.
They're not
It seems to be.
real.
Yeah.
It seems to be. I joked about Joel Stewart, who's the Confederate guy. My father met Joel Shrewsbury, who was one of the oldest living Confederate veterans in Missouri back when in 1931 or 32, and he was in his 90s. And I asked my father what was he like. My father was born. I was born very late in their life. that he was really tall with green eyes and loud. I don't know where the hell I got that from. But he said he had one arm, but he didn't lose it in the war. And he told him a lot of different things. And I jokingly use that as my template for this person I keep writing things about. I make him be in El Paso at different times. I said, if I ever discovered he was really in the places I'm talking about, I'm gonna shit. And it turns out he was really in Juarez at the turn of the century, and I'm like, how? I did not know that. I didn't realize that. I'm like, I don't think he was fighting a Lovecraftian monster that shoved nigger off, but who can
Well,
say?
did they ever tell you how he lost his arm?
They said he lost it before the war, but they never said how.
Was it fighting a Lovecraftian
So he went to
monster?
war with one arm
Yes,
and
he had
came
one.
back?
He scalped people with one arm. Wow. So I got in Stronger Than Death. You see a flashback of the Civil War, and he would ride with the reins in his teeth. I made him, Mr. Cogburnish, of course, for that. But I thought, because he really did ride with one arm. But they said he collected scalps, and I said, how could you scalp somebody with one arm? Easy. You bite the back of their head. You go like this. That's the first thing you see in Stronger Than Death, is him scalping somebody with
Another
one arm.
happy family story.
Another family story.
Available at the Literary Underworld table.
But I mean, it's but I mean, that's sometimes characters like that. When you hear somebody that really did something like that in your lifetime, you thought, how in the hell did he do that? And it's just, and that's my blood. But I mean, they said he wasn't. As I was telling you, when I just basically explored him as an old man, and that guy who was a real killer, awesome killer, and hell of a guy, goes, I wanted to ask you, why do I like killing people so much? You've done it since the war. You're 90. You've killed all these other people that come to get you. Why do I get a hard on from it? Why do I like it so much? And as through this book, you've seen this old man systematically kill a bunch of people. And he looks at this intense warrior and goes, because you're fucking crazy, that's why. He goes, I didn't like killing anybody I ever killed. They all come to me. He was in the war. He goes, you gotta be nuts to like killing somebody. And that isn't the reaction you thought you were gonna get. And I didn't plan that before I wrote the scene. All of a sudden, he just kind of was like, I never liked killing anybody. And that was him, although he was bloodthirsty, and the part of the Missouri War that had been written about with Lawrence and everything else, it was a lot of revenge and a lot of nonsense, but those guys had a reason for what they did. His family was killed by Kansas Redlegs. He did what he did at the time for revenge and left Missouri to go to Nebraska territory. That's the true story on his account. He chopped off a false arm and put it on his sling and walked out in a Union uniform. That's how he escaped from Independence, Missouri.
Wow.
Interesting character. But I said, that was his life. That's the way he was forced into it. Now, what he has done from the end of the Civil War on, much different story. It was by pure choice. He either was forced on him or it was by choice. That's cool to explore a guy like that. Because, I mean, good night. Look at the chances from 1865 to 1932. What kind of a life is that? And he still was intense when my father met him. And I've never visited his grave in Joplin, but I kind of want to. So.
Well, and sometimes you'll do that. Sometimes you'll create these minor, what in your mind is a minor character, but because you have to make them live and breathe just as much as the main characters in order for people to, accept them and care about them, you've got their whole backstory in your head too. So it's they get their own spin-off, and you do what happens to George after graduation, or what happened to the police detective in his former job, that now he's this grizzled old guy that just doesn't care about anyone or anything. He's just doing the job, and to go into to get a chance to explore that and to play with all that is really a lot of fun.
Well, that goes toward the series too, and the overarching that the series doesn't always have to be one character.
Right.
The series can be the elements of the story, it can be the atmosphere, it can be the environment, it can be the history, and you can have all kinds of branches come out of that as long as there's a common thread. A series doesn't have to be one character.
Well, Stephen King did it with the Castle Rock stories. There's I have lost count how many short stories and novels were centered on the fictional Castle Rock, Maine, till he blew it up. But I mean, they aren't one overall story, but it's the commonality of place that gives us something familiar to return to. And I think that's helpful for the reader. It sets it in something that they're familiar with, and they're more likely to want to return there.
And if it's somebody who's read all that author's works, it's fun for the reader. You know, it's like getting to go back to Disneyland after 10 years or whatever. You get to see how people that you know have changed, how places have changed, and it's fun as the reader to be able to go back. It's like a class reunion almost.
You may have heard this saying, because I've heard it a couple times, that your ending should be surprising but inevitable. Have you ever heard that?
Yes.
Saying? And actually watching these guys, I watched the movie D4. If any of you got to see it, it was a good movie. And the last few minutes of it, that's exactly how I felt. It was like, good surprise, but also sort of inevitable. It was, exactly that kind of ending. And so in a series, it's kind of hard if you're building a series without an end in sight to do that. For me, I had a trilogy, so I did have an end in sight. But the one temptation I had was to withhold some of the secrets. There were certain secrets that were big, overarching secrets that need to be held to the end. But there were other little things I'm like, I don't want to give that away in this book because maybe it's something I need for the next book. And I wasn't trusting that the character was as deep as she was. And so I went ahead and let some of the stuff come out in the first book that I didn't necessarily mean to or intend to originally, but I trusted, okay, I think I can reveal that. I know there's going to be more layers. I just haven't seen them all yet. And then sure enough, some of it was something in her family and some other stuff. But, I do think it's important to have a few things set up because you need those in place if you're doing a series over a couple books. Otherwise, people are going to see the holes back there that weren't filled for your surprise. But trust your characters to have more layers. If they start to reveal smaller surprises, it's okay to give readers some fun.
It's almost a challenge to say, I'm bright enough to come up with something original next book. Well, because usually I'll just chop it off and say, okay, this is it. And I'm like, okay, I'm sure I'll come up with something.
Well, the other thing is that after you write your first draft, put it away for a little while and move on and do something else and then come back to it. Because a lot of times when you reread what you've written, the real themes of it, because when you're writing it, you're just trying to get it out of your head. You're just writing it and trying to put it down on paper. But when you reread it after it's written, that's when you start to notice the commonalities and the themes and what the book is really about. And then when you go back through and do the next draft, you can bring that information out and make it more evident that that's what the theme of the book was. And if it's a theme that you can carry on into other books.
It doesn't occur to you in the first draft.
Right.
Yeah. It might change by the end or in the
I have my first readers point out my themes to me.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, that.
Sometimes it's from letters. I didn't even see the allegory that was being drawn in this book until I got a letter from someone saying, "Oh, this really helped me understand what you were talking about with gay rights." I'm like, actually, I was aiming for the Jim Crow laws of the 1920s, but now that you mention it,
yeah.
Silence. Okay.
Well, does anybody?
There was a question.
Yeah. I would say it sounds like a lot of you all have stumbled on your franchise character sort of by accident, by happy accident. What advice would you have for the writer who is planning a series that has one main character? What do you need to think about in terms of keeping that character consistent but fresh from novel to novel?
The character isn't enough. The coolest character in the world is not going to hold people's interest if everything around him. Yeah. The setting, secondary characters that continue, as well as the secondary characters that you kill in terrible ways. Wait, is that just me? It needs to be more than a character. It needs to be a world, a web of interpersonal characteristics and personalities and relationships. That is something that is or existed before and will continue after.
Well, I think that there gets to be a difference. There's a difference between plot and character.
I was going to say the whole thing is you can have. I mean, I wouldn't write Superman because he's too perfect. But I mean, if you got Batman or a character that's a cool guy, flawed guy, interesting to explore, don't mean a hell of crap if it isn't a good story. Your world, everything, the world can't be the story. I see people craft things, begin to spend a lot of time on creation of their world. your story has to matter and be believable and entertaining, aside from how many, flaming leprechauns can fly in. I mean, I'm telling you.
God.
I love your images I give you.
Why do you do this to me?
It's just you. I mean, no matter what you can create, as horrific or as creative or as spacey, your story's got to be there, or it's dead, or it's just kind of bland or going through the motions. If you got your character, good thing. How he reacts to his around world is a good idea. What's the story of the book? What's the story that's being conveyed? How is he? Is it something, a situation he's in, or what is the reaction of the whole plot? I mean, you got to come up with a good, feasible thing, or I'd say work on your story really well. Aside when you got your guy or girl or thing, make sure you got a good story to go with it. Because as fun as like Hog was, monster ripping up the floor, that isn't what the story isn't about. The creature tearing the town up.
Oh, the town isn't what I was thinking about.
The town breathes the whole time. Well,
yeah.
It's amazing you drew that part out of the book, and it's something I don't even.
I ain't alone, man. The Hog goes for a particular part of the male anatomy.
As far as the character
He's a mean
goes,
creature.
and keeping the character real and interesting, you've got to find their vulnerabilities, and you've got to find their fallibilities. You've got to find those two things and exploit those.
The perfect person is no fun to read about.
Superman is nowhere near as fun as Batman.
Of course.
Never.
One thing, someone pointed this out to me, an author I respect a lot, and he brought up something I've never heard talked about in a conference or anything. He brought up status, and what he means by it is you and I could have a relationship, and maybe in our relationship, I've had books published, and so I have a higher status, and I don't mean this, I'm only using this as an example. But then I could get to talk to my dad, and he has a higher status than I do. My dad's talking to his boss, there's a different status. Maybe I have a higher status than his boss in our relationship. And not trying to think in class systems, but the idea that in any setting, there's certain people who are sort of the dominant person in that. I mean, a panel, there's usually someone who kind of takes over, doesn't mean they're dominant.
That's all you should.
And actually, that doesn't always mean they're dominant. That can even be a sign of insecurity. But you know what I'm talking about. So if you take your character and you find out which you watch, you can take a different book and bring in different relationships where the status is totally different, and it can change the way your character responds and bring out different parts of their character that weren't even in a different scene or a
they're
different
strong
book.
in one story and then a weak in another.
Yeah, I mean, maybe whether it's in a relationship, in a dating relationship, or maybe someone from their past and their family, or, there's all kinds of ways, or even the villain that they're dealing with. So it can bring out different aspects of them, and just be aware of that, the status. An example he gave to me is just, you can come into a room and where your boss is, and he starts to talk, and you instantly stop because, okay, I'm not going to keep interrupting. But your little sister comes running in, she starts to interrupt, and you're like, shut up, I'm talking, but you wouldn't say that to your boss. So it's a status issue. And it's interesting watching your characters. I never even thought of it until he said it. I was like, wow, that's really
They talked about that actually in theater training when I was an actress 150 years ago. They
Can
they
I
tell
borrow
us
your face cream?
I was exaggerating slightly, but they tell us the king isn't the king unless everyone bows when he steps on the stage. And they were telling us this about physical acting, on how we were supposed to act around physical response and body language when the king walks onto the stage. But it always stuck with me that it doesn't matter what the king is wearing. If they know he's the king, they will treat him as the king, and he isn't the king unless everyone is acknowledging him that way. And I see that too when you watch just watch a show like The West Wing, and how everyone reacts when President Bartlett walks into the room. It's physical acting. So in an episode in the first season, when he loses consciousness and collapses, the whole room is rocked because the king, who is the most powerful one in the room, has fallen.
Ever seen the Tudors when Henry walks in? How many people they got to have move?
Yes.
Everybody bows, everybody backs up, everybody drops their head.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just like, I remember seeing the whole cathedral's like, God, man, what timing? I mean, everybody is like it ripples as he walks through. I mean, it's really cool. But yeah, everybody's like, yep, that's the king.
And more subtle now, when the president walked in fiction or in fact, when the president walks in the room and there are military men in the room, they snap to attention and they salute him. And that kind of respect.
Well, they just gave us the 5-minute mark.
Really?
Has anybody,
Keep trying.
has anybody done a series where you literally have two main characters that are, you follow them from A to B to C?
Yeah, that's my.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, with the fantasy series I'm doing now, it's not just two. It's more of a ensemble, and they each have their own arc, and they each have their own quest per se. But it's totally modern times. But so I'm telling the story of multiple characters and where they're going and how they all interact, and sometimes you'll have each part of that will have its own focus. For instance, like in one book you're focused on this, but this other thing's still going on in the background, and then on the next book it's more focused on that, but the other thing is still going on. So you can do that. You can just think of it like a spotlight. Now the spotlight is on this person, and then the spotlight in the next scene shifts to someone else, and you can have consecutive. My brain is baked away.
No, my theater
Simultaneous,
professor
thank you.
called it that the protagonist of the story is the one who is changed by the end of the book.
Right.
And that can be more than one person. I wouldn't suggest having too many people be the one that changes by the end, but that's what I tend to look for.
You went to college for this, I want to hear what you have to say.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just kidding. Put the spotlight back on there.
Word on
Two
something.
protagonists.
I wanted to add a point about what we were talking about with status and pecking order, is that most of that stuff is done non-verbally.
Mm-hmm.
You very rarely tell somebody you're above them. You show them through eye contact and through body language and through how you conduct yourselves, and I think that's what ends up making it believable in writing. I always, if I'm watching a movie or reading a book, if somebody puts somebody in their place verbally, they kind of lose me at that point, because I know that's not realistic. That's not how we interact as human beings. Most of that stuff is conveyed without a word. It's done just by how people tone of voice. There was actually there's been a study that was done on presidential debates, and you can listen to the tone of voice of the two candidates, and the one who has the more consistent tone of voice throughout the debates, 99% of the time is the one who wins the election, because the other one changes their voice to try to react against the other person, or the other one keeps their tone of voice consistent, and that projects in a nonverbal way, just from the tone, it projects leadership. And that's those kinds of things are really how we establish pecking order, and it's never said.
I'm gonna also look those
Think
up
of the
on
judge
YouTube
in the
now.
Casey Anthony trial. That judge had total control, and he was one of the most even-keeled guys I'd ever seen. I was like, that guy is awesome. I would love to write a character like him. Just sits there, total control. That 6 days in jail for flipping someone off in the courtroom, but totally cool. I mean, status.
Studying human behavior makes for good interaction around any serious character or anyone like that. I mean, it's being around real people and not just stuff you might have read in a book or something. You can't beat human contact, whether you like folks or not.
Well, we like you.
I mean, but like I'm saying, I mean, it's an interesting study of how people are, and that makes for an interesting story, aside from whatever your plot is, of how everybody interacts with everybody else.
Before we go away, I have a giveaway for whoever's birthday is closest to today. Anyone within 2 weeks? Either before or after?
August 3rd, I don't know what that means.
Is anybody closer than August 3rd?
I'm also August 3rd.
August 9th? Okay, it's for you.
She's August 3rd too.
Oh, August 13th? Oh, close.
No,
Third too. Third also.
Oh, third also.
Third also.
Well, I have to. Oh, sorry. They pointed at you. And Shrew's and I are doing a reading at 11.
Oh, and there's a book launch at 9 in the room right below this one.
Okay, yeah.
Where is panel room C? Does anyone
For a beer and a
It's
hamburger.
Of course it is.
It's a very small room. I don't know if my voice will carry.